Dear ladies and gentlemen, it's a wonderful feeling to be back in CU's auditorium. So let me welcome you at this hybrid event of the Democracy Institute of Central European University. My name is Antony. I'm lead researcher at the DEI's De-Democratization and Re-Democratization Working Group, and it is my privilege to chair this event. This is a hybrid event, as I mentioned, so we are live on Facebook. I suggest those who follow us on Facebook to post their questions, comments in the comment section. When our speaker visited us a couple of months ago, we agreed that he will return to see you in spring, and he will give a talk on Central Europe. The tragic events of the last months led to a change in these plans. The lecture will reflect on the war against Ukraine and on its consequences. Universities react in various ways to the Russian aggression. I'm happy to report that CEU participates not only in charity events, but it has also launched, with the support of the Open Society University Network, fellowships for Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Russian scholars. This is part of the Threatened Scholar Initiative. It initiated new research project counting on the collaboration of colleagues from these countries. And we will also start certificate programs explicitly tailored to students at Ukrainian universities. And we will start these programs within weeks from now. And now to our speaker. Timothy Garton is an eminent historian, writer, and professor of European politics at the University of Oxford. In Oxford, he's also Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's College and director of the Darendorf Program for the Study of Freedom. Furthermore, he is senior fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Timothy Garton is a leading commentator on European affairs, syndicated columnist at Garton, and frequent contributor to the New York Review of Books. He published several volumes on communism, secret police, democratic transition in Eastern Europe, liberalism, free speech, and many other relevant political subjects. He received numerous awards, including the highly prestigious Charlemagne Award. He's an intellectual mentor for many scholars in Eastern and Western Europe, and he's also a moral and political compass for many of us. So please, Timothy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Joel, for that very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be back here in person, physically. The Central European University is still here. The Democracy Institute is here. And maybe one day democracy will be back here. We are, of course, here at a really important moment for democracy in Central Europe, just days before the first major national election in Europe since the beginning of the Ukraine war, an election which is hugely problematic, the most problematic national election inside the EU, as the OSCE monitors have just once again pointed out. My lecture will be in two parts. We have to start with the war in Ukraine. However tentative my remarks on that will be, the causes, the course, and consequences of that war. And then I want to turn to what was going to be the original subject of the lecture I promised to give, which is the future of democracy in Central Europe. So first of all, on the war. 3 years ago, I started writing a history of contemporary Europe. And at the end of the first chapter, which is of course about the ruined Europe in the hell of 1945, I asked the question, are we fated to go all the way back? Little did I think that 3 years later, that question would have been answered. Because if you look at what is happening in Ukraine, if you look at Mariupol, which looks like Coventry or Dresden or Hamburg, if you look at the millions of refugees and expellees, some of whom I had the chance to talk to yesterday in the refugee centers here in Budapest, if you look at the bombing of the site of Babin Yar, if you look at the fate of a man called Boris, Romanchenko, who survived Buchenwald and 3 other Nazi concentration camps, only to be killed by one of Vladimir Putin's Mussars in Kharkiv, you have to say we have gone all the way back, or at least almost all the way back. We said never again after 1945. It happened again in former Yugoslavia, about which Michael Ignatieff, who's here, and many others wrote so eloquently. Srebrenica was, without question, in quality as bad as the worst we saw in the Second World War, but not in quantity and scale and consequences. This is the closest we have come to a major war and a war of terror in Europe since 1945. And I think that's the first thing that simply has to be stated and immediately poses the question, how did we allow this to happen? That takes me to the causes. There is an extremely frustrating debate going on at the moment, which I want to start with, which, as so often, attributes everything that goes wrong in the world to us, to the West, and in particular to the United States, best of all for Europeans, if it can be the United States' fault. And therefore, NATO enlargement is held to be responsible for the war in Ukraine. Let me say very briefly on this myth, first of all, that I hope nobody believes that NATO enlargement is any justification for Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine, even if you think it's part of the explanation. Secondly, I hope no one is so childishly naive as to believe that if only we hadn't enlarged NATO to the western frontier of Russia, if only Mr. Putin would have been sitting in the Kremlin peacefully eating his pelmeni while a sovereign, democratic, independent Ukraine emerged on his borders. How naive could you get? In my view, the fundamental mistake we made was not all along to anticipate that the motherland or fatherland of the largest surviving European empire, which softly and suddenly vanished away in just 3 years, both the external Soviet empire and the internal empire that was the Soviet Union, that motherland or fatherland would not sooner or later have a powerful, strong, and probably violent reaction. Countries don't like giving up empires. Ask the British. I'm not going to say ask the Hungarians, because that would take us into other territory, but I did yesterday visit the Trianon monument just opposite Parliament opened a mere 100 years after the Treaty of Trianon. We should have known that from history and should have anticipated that strong reaction. I'm not going to say that the shape it took was inevitable. Of course it wasn't. As you remember, Boris Yeltsin briefly toyed with the idea that Boris Nemtsov should be his successor, not Vladimir Putin. European history would have been very different if his successor had been Boris Nemtsov and not Vladimir Putin. But nonetheless, I met Vladimir Putin in 1994. When he was deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. Nobody had heard of the man. I met him at a conference in St. Petersburg. He was already talking about the lost Russian territories outside the Russian Federation. He explicitly mentioned Crimea. He was talking about the 25 million Russians who are outside the Russian Federation, who he said Russia had, recognize this phrase, a duty to protect. Long before NATO enlargement, that basic post-imperial reaction was there. And then you add to it the fear of democracy. So if you look at the chronology of Putin's both domestic and external policy, It's quite clear that the Orange Revolution in Ukraine of 2004 to 2005 is a very important turning point, when he began to think that democracy, in his view, created conspiratorially by the West, color revolutions, was coming to his front yard. And both the domestic repression starts stepping up at that point. Konstantin von Eggert, the very fine Russian journalist, said the most important event in Russian politics in the last 20 years, he said, in about 2010, happened outside Russia. It was the Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And so if you take the post-imperial reaction, Ukraine is not really a country, as Putin has explained. It's essentially part of Russia. He's a Ukraine denier. And the fear of democracy. You have two overwhelmingly powerful motives for the action he has taken. And by the way, just to come back to the NATO enlargement point for a moment, if you want to argue that without NATO enlargement, this might not have happened, then you have to ask yourself what it would have felt like to be in the city of Narva on the Estonian-Russian frontier with an 80% ethnic Russian population in Estonia, in Latvia, in Lithuania, in Poland, or indeed in Hungary, had NATO not enlarged. You have to follow the counterfactual through. So absolutely, I think that what has happened today is proof positive that we did precisely the right thing in enlarging both the EU and NATO as far as was feasible, QED. What I would concede is that the compromise reached at the Bucharest NATO summit in 2008 gave us the worst of both worlds. If you remember, the United States wanted to start a membership action plan for Ukraine and Georgia. France, Germany, and many other European countries didn't want to do anything of the kind. The lousy compromise reached was that the concluding summit says Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO, but we're not actually going to do anything about it. And that actually reflected a broader strategic confusion in Europe and the West about what our policy was towards the rest of Europe, which is not in the EU and NATO, which has prevailed ever since. And I'll come back to that point towards the end of my lecture. The other point I want to make, of course, there's much more to be said on the causes, but the other point I want to make is just very quickly in reflecting on liberalism and the necessary self-criticism of liberalism, that I think, to put it as concisely as possible, a mistake we did make was to think of freedom too much as process and not as struggle. The shadow, the faint shadow of modernization theory was still somehow with us in the notion that freedom was process that followed from certain given infrastructural elements. No, freedom is always struggle. It has to be fought for every day. And this, I think, is what Ukraine is reminding us. Let me turn from the causes to the course of the war. Every peace begins with a war, and the character of the peace depends crucially on the course of the war. So there is absolutely no point in doing what our media is spending endless time doing, which is talking about possible peace outcomes from these negotiations, because it will depend on the course of the war. And the big thing that has changed in the last 37 days since the 24th of February is the extraordinary military and, let me emphasize, civil resistance of the Ukrainians, which has completely changed the situation on the ground. So that the first thing to say immediately is that if we want to influence the peace and therefore the consequences, we have to influence the course of the war. And President Zelensky on his Twitter account, tells us with crystal clarity what he needs from us: weapons, sanctions, and the prospect of EU membership. He could not be clearer. He says that to every European leader. On weapons, we've done a great deal, but we could still do a lot more. And on sanctions, we've done a great deal, but we could still do a lot more, notably an oil and gas embargo. This is the big thing which would really hit Putin right where it hurts in his war chest. I don't need to remind you that Viktor Orban is the EU leader most clearly opposed to doing both those things that we should do. The absolutely scandalous message that he sent to those Hungarian citizens who had signed up for information about the COVID pandemic and had been foolish enough to tick the box saying, do you want more information? Effectively an act of massive disloyalty to colleagues in the EU and NATO, in which he comes back from the summits in Brussels of NATO and EU, in which he agreed the common position, and immediately says, but what we've done is to prevent more weapons being sent, at least through Hungary, and to prevent any more sanctions. And by the way, this is not a trivial point. We, the West, are trying to put in $1 billion worth of arms, new weapons supplies, through 2 or 3 routes, mainly through Poland and Romania. To have an additional route, even if it goes over the Carpathian Mountains, is not insignificant. So it has real significance to the prospect for the Ukrainian struggle. But I have to say with regret that while Viktor Orban is the outlier on this issue, particularly on the sanctions point, he is not alone. Those of you who listened to BBC Radio this morning would have heard Zoltan Kovacs Jesuitically making the case that Viktor Orban was doing nothing that wasn't being done by Germany and Austria and Italy and multiple other powers. I have to say with great regret that there is just a grain of truth within this larger untruth, because it is the case that Germany in particular is strongly resisting those, in my view, very important sanctions. Understandably, 55% of their gas comes from Russia, a third of their overall energy input. But this means that Germany alone, since the beginning of this war, has paid over 7 billion euros directly into the war chest of Vladimir Putin. Germany alone, more than 7 billion, funds that can be used for a war of terror in the very territory in Ukraine where 80 years ago, Nazi Germany waged a war of terror. The same villages, the same towns, the same countryside. So there is a larger moral challenge, I think, to the rest of us in Europe. Let me turn now very tentatively to the question of consequences and therefore to democracy in Central Europe. Now, Zsolt mentioned that when I was here in October and we had a small seminar, I promised to come back around the time of the election. And I thought I was going to talk about democracy in Central Europe and take issue with a text written by Viktor Orban, which 1 or 2 of you may have seen, outrageously called Samizdat number 12. I don't need to remind you that Samizdat was unofficial publishing by dissidents who had no other access to the public sphere under Soviet bloc regimes. Viktor Orban controls close to 80% of the media in Hungary, and anything he says will be reported in all the media. So it's beyond chutzpah to describe this essay as Samizdat. But the theme of this essay was, in a polemic with me, that I totally misunderstood his position and that he'd explained that position in a recent lecture to the Mátyás Corvinus College. And it was that he, Orban, and Fidesz were standing up for the true, the Christian, the conservative, the paternalist, the pro-natalist Europe, against the neo-Marxist, woke, weak, rich West represented by Brussels. Now, the interesting point about this lecture is that he did it in the name of Central Europe. He was purporting to speak for Central Europe, that Central Europe represented this position. And he even went so far as to say, read Milan Kundera. Now, I don't need to remind this audience of the Central European University that the notion of Central Europe that Milan Kundera advanced and Václav Havel and Georgi Konrad and in my own small way, I myself helped to advance in the 1980s, was the diametric opposite. It was 180 degrees opposite from that being advanced by Viktor Orban in this essay. Central Europe stood precisely for the values of the West, of Europe, of human rights, of democracy, of tolerance, of multiculturalism. And Central Europe was to be a ferry. A Hungarian author talked once about Central Europe as a ferry. Central Europe was to be a ferry to take countries like Hungary from the East, where they had found themselves after 1945, to the West. Now, 30 years later, as advanced by Viktor Orban, Central Europe was to be a ferry to take Hungary and Poland and other countries from the West towards the East, because the ideological content of his concept of Europe was to a significant degree Putinesque, admittedly identifying with Western Christianity rather than Eastern Christianity, but with that small difference, the Putinesque values that are also on the referendum ballot paper on the 3rd of April here in Budapest. So it was the precise opposite of the original conception of Central Europe, which, of course, fundamentally informed the founding of the Central European University. Central Europe, in the naming of this university, was not just a geographical expression. It was a set of values associated with that notion of Central Europe. Now, what has changed in the 6 months to a year is, first of all, political change, notably in Slovakia with the election of President Čaputová, and more recently in the Czech Republic with the narrow victory of a united opposition, note of hope, and then the Ukraine war, which has put Poland, having a government ideologically deeply sympathetic to and admiring of Fidesz, at loggerheads with Viktor Orban's government. So between the political change in the Czech Republic and Slovakia and the, so to speak, geopolitical change in Poland, Viktor Orban has, in a sense, lost Central Europe. That is to say, he's lost the rest of the Visegrad Four. And the wonderful token of this was the refusal of the other V4 members to join a recent V4 summit in Budapest, with, as you know, the Czech defense minister saying that he couldn't attend a meeting with a government which prioritized cheap Russian oil over Ukrainian blood. So the Central European context has changed fundamentally in just the last year or so. And I think Zsolt was mentioning to me the other day, and it seems to be the case, that we hear rather less talk of Central Europe specifically from Viktor Orban of late, because he's lost the rest of Central Europe. Now, many would take from this, and some do, a message of hope, which is the Ukraine war is terrible, but at least it's united the West again. At least it's united Europe again. And there are tones, I have to say, of rather exaggerated self-congratulation to be heard from Brussels on this point. And at the same time, it's divided Central Europe against itself. So you might take this to be a message of optimism. I'm afraid I want to caution against that optimism, because I fear this may be short-term. And in the second part of my lecture, I want to lay out two broad paths down which I think Europe may go, which will have serious consequences for the future of democracy in Central Europe, but which Central Europe itself can also influence. On the one hand, these are the two paths. The soi-disant realist path, or what I would call the realistic idealist path. The path which objectively accepts a future of division, or the path that still holds to an ideal and goal of unity. The path that can be described in shorthand as a new Yalta, and the path that can be described in shorthand as Helsinki. A path of double standards, which accepts that Europe will be divided between happier parts where post-colonial norms will continue to apply, and an unhappier eastern part where colonial norms will again apply, and on the other hand, a part which has single standards and continues to aspire to post-colonial norms of equal standing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, for all the countries in Europe, although accepting that that might be a longer term. Let me start with the latter path, which is the one, of course, which I wholeheartedly embrace and wish Europe to embrace strategically. But let me say at once, which I think is the less likely path for Europe to go, I'm afraid. So this, as a strategy, would accept that the cliches of German Ostpolitik, that security can only be achieved with Russia and can never be achieved against Russia, were fundamentally mistaken, would accept that for at least as long as Vladimir Putin is in power in the Kremlin, but possibly even with some of his likely successors, security for Europe can only be achieved against Russia, from Russia, and not with Russia, and that therefore we have to have a strategy that builds Europe from Europe out, a distinctive strategy for Belarus, for Ukraine, for Moldova, for Georgia, accepting that we're going to have to secure ourselves against Russia for the foreseeable future. And for me, the key component of this would be to accept President Zelensky's plea. Think of it. This guy in the middle of a war, in his bunker, every day at risk of his own life, not just from bombs, but from assassination squads. And what does he say to every European leader? He says, please accept us as a candidate for membership of the European Union. It's that important to him. It's as important as weapons and sanctions. And what Europe's leaders did in the Versailles summit was yet again to dodge the issue, as they have been doing for the last 20 years. I said to then European Commission President José Manuel Barroso in 2005, after the Orange Revolution, why don't you come out and say we actually want Ukraine to be a member state of the European Union? And he said, I would immediately be slapped down by two large member states. Guess which? France, Germany. And here we are, 17 years later, and the same is true. The same is true. The EU is still not prepared, even to make the statement in principle that we wish to accept the Ukraine Ukraine as a candidate for EU membership, knowing full well that it would be a process of 15 plus years. If you make that statement of principle for Ukraine, it means you make it for Moldova, you make it for Georgia, you make it when it becomes possible for Belarus, and you necessarily make it also for the Western Balkans, because clearly you can't say that the Western Balkans then have to go behind Ukraine. And this at a time when, as many of you know, the situation in Bosnia is extremely fragile because of the policies of the leadership of Republika Srpska and of Serbia itself, with a little help from Viktor Orban. So that while we're still talking about the new Srebrenica, there's a danger again in the original Bosnia. So what that gives you is a long-term strategy, because it remains, in my view, the case, and I'd be happy to be challenged on this, that accession conditionality for the EU remains the most powerful instrument we have for consolidating democratization in European countries. And everything that is proposed short of that seems to me very much second best and not credible as an incentive for consolidated democratization, knowing full well that this process will take a very long time. Let's have no illusions about that. But there's a corollary to that, because as all of you know, sitting in this place, the great mistake we made over the last 30 years was to have very significant and indeed rigorous accession conditionality and no post-accession conditionality, right? So once you'd got inside, you could, to say it colloquially, get away with murder. You could roll back all those things you have done. And as we have seen, I have to say, for me, still shockingly, you can simply erode liberal democracy in a full member state of the European Union, namely Hungary, to the degree that most political scientists would, I think, agree that we're no longer sitting in a democracy. We're sitting in a hybrid regime, competitive authoritarian, electoral authoritarian, choose your term. And that was possible inside the European Union. I have, by the way, to pay tribute here to our colleague Jan Werner Müller, who I think is somewhere with us here, up there on the advisory board of DI. Jan Werner presciently, in an essay published already in 2013, posed the question, can a dictatorship be a member of the EU? A pretty good question to ask back then. And while the answer is clearly not a full-blown dictatorship can be a member of the EU, clearly a hybrid regime can be a member of the EU. So there's a clear connection between the embrace of EU enlargement and therefore accession conditionality and the need for stronger post-accession conditionality, as in instruments like the rule of law mechanism, the proposal for linking next-gen EU funds to issues around rule of law, democracy, media pluralism, and so on. And let me just remind you that the history of the EU is not one in which widening has led to weakening. It is one in which widening has led to deepening. And I see no reason why that logic should not continue to apply. So that is the course which I feel very strongly Europe should follow. However, I fear it is not the course that Europe is likely to follow. And let me now turn to the other side of the story, the first set of alternatives. I think there is a very significant danger that EU leaders, particularly in Western Europe, faced with the overwhelming challenge of becoming serious about European defense against Russia, which means getting serious about defending what is currently a hardly defended eastern frontier of NATO with just a few thousand troops and deterrence, faced with the serious prospect that the United States will go Trumpian again in 2024, and therefore Europe will actually have to do more for its own defense, which is, let me assure you, part of the thinking behind Olaf Scholz's announcement of the increase in German defense spending, faced with economic circumstances in which, as a result of COVID and the war, you will have soaring inflation with very high levels of both public and private debt and possibly stagflation, with its political consequences, namely quite likely a renaissance of populism. Even as we speak, Marine Le Pen is suddenly doing remarkably well in the French elections. We'd all been assuming Macron had it in the bag. And the challenge of addressing climate change at the same time as securing energy security from Russia. Faced with all those very large challenges that the leaders of the main powers of the EU will be prepared to accept a rotten peace in Ukraine, a Carthaginian peace, a Munich settlement, just as long as it's stopping the war, will be prepared to accept a colonial logic for the parts of Europe that are not in the EU and NATO. And believe me, such voices are to be heard, a logic of spheres of influence, where the former colonial power has special rights in certain of its former colonial territories, a logic that no one would countenance for 5 seconds if it was about the British Empire or the French Empire. But people are remarkably happy to countenance, notably on the left, when it comes to the Russian Empire. And as a kind of corollary of that, are not going to commit to the prospect of EU membership, giving all sorts of, in my view, highly tendentious arguments, such as we can't possibly offer EU membership to a country which has a frozen conflict. Remind me, isn't Cyprus a member of the EU? Doesn't Cyprus have a frozen conflict? Remind me, wasn't Germany a frozen conflict for 40 years? What was the division of Germany between 1949 and 1990 but a frozen conflict? Mysteriously, that didn't stop West Germany becoming a member of the European community. So these are implausible and tendentious arguments, but such arguments will be advanced to make the case against a promise of EU membership, meaning that the European countries in the post-Soviet space will be zwischen Europa. They'll be in a limbo between West and East, forced to do forms of arbitrage between the West and Russia and China. But there's a corollary of that, in my view, which is that I think it also potentially follows from that quite plausibly, that you also soft pedal issues of rule of law and democracy in countries like Hungary and Poland. In Poland, in particular, because unlike Hungary, it is actually acting as a frontline state in response to the war in Ukraine. It is being one of the most, if I can put it this way, stalwart countries in the Western alliance in response to Putin's war of aggression against Ukraine, and has taken in more than 2 million refugees from Ukraine, in a country of 38 million people, many of whom will actually stay in Poland, unlike most of those in Hungary. So I can see a distinct temptation to soft pedal that agenda, to settle for some weak compromise on issues of rule of law, given these other priorities. Now, there is serious discussion in Brussels of a kind of divide and rule between Poland and Hungary. So the notion would be that you would go tough on Poland, but go soft on Poland, but be tougher on Hungary. But once again, I'm not persuaded, nobody can know, but I'm not persuaded how long that's going to last. I think the same temptation would be there, because feeding into this and this is a university that does a lot of very fine history and cultural studies, are certain older cultural stereotypes, beautifully described by Larry Wolff in his book, Inventing Eastern Europe. Those cultural stereotypes of the Enlightenment which believe that this isn't really quite proper Enlightenment Europe, that proper Europe is the Carolingian core. It's France, it's Italy, it's Germany, it's a Benelux, maybe the Iberian Peninsula. Believe me, these views are still very widespread. These old prejudices or stereotypes are still very widespread amongst many West Europeans, some of whom will say privately that it was a mistake to enlarge the EU to include countries like Poland and Hungary, so that in this picture, what you would end up with is a kind of Europe A, which is core Carolingian Europe, a Europe B, which is East Central Europe, and a Europe C, which is Zwischeneuropa, with countries like Ukraine and Moldova. This is, of course, not inevitable, but it seems to me a plausible, a possible future. I've said this before, I'll say it again. The key swing state is, of course, Germany. Germany's fundamental assumptions in its Ostpolitik have just been completely blown out of the water. The country is totally disoriented. There is a serious discussion there. If we, and I say we in this context, could persuade Germany under its traffic light coalition to embrace the strategy that I've outlined, maybe under the heading of a new European Ostpolitik, that would hugely influence the policy of the entire EU. So there, I think, is where one of the great strategic arguments of the next year to 18 months is going to be the choice between those two paths. But, and this is my very last point before throwing it open, East Central Europe still has agency in this. The outcome of the Hungarian election is enormously important in this respect, because with a victory for the opposition, you would have a very different Central Europe, a Central Europe which was returning to the original notions of Central Europe from 30, 35 years ago. Now, I'm not going to trespass on the territory of the great experts on Hungarian politics who are in this room, and in fact, I would very much like to hear from them. But I don't need to remind you that even were the opposition to win, and I'm afraid looking at the opinion polling, that is the grammatical formulation that one probably realistically has to have, even if the opposition were to win, let us hope, there would clearly be a huge job of dismantling an embedded hybrid regime with multiple blocking positions requiring the constitutional majority and therefore the constitutional conundrum of whether you need a single revolutionary act of breaking the law to restore the rule of law in the broader generic sense. But if it goes the other way, and as seems likely, Fidesz again wins, I'm afraid I don't accept the conclusion, which has been widely touted recently, that Orban's Hungarian model is dead, that he can simply no longer go on having his cake and eat it, to use the Boris Johnson phrase, good being in the West, being in the EU and NATO, but very close relations with Russia and China. If my second scenario, the more pessimistic scenario, emerges, it seems to me there are still considerable possibilities, albeit somewhat more limited, for playing both sides of the fence. But I hope I'm right in that. As I say, I would love to hear from you, from the Hungarian experts in the room. So in conclusion, let me just say this. The prospects for the future of democracy in Central Europe depends to a significant degree on the larger strategic choice that I've outlined being made by the rest of Europe, But the larger chance of restoring democracy also depends to a considerable degree on the agency of East Central Europeans, and not least of Hungarians in the next 3 days. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this sober, realistic, sometimes disillusioned talk that at the very same time was inspiring and highlighting the resilience of the spirit of freedom. Now, I will collect some questions from Facebook, but I will also give the floor to colleagues present here in the room. We have a mic here. And maybe, is there a different one up there? I'm just looking for mic, whether we have another one, no? So then we can use this one. Good. Then I ask first our previous lecturer.
Tim, Mike Ignatieff, that was a wonderful talk, and I think everybody in the room is grateful to you for it. 2 questions. One, having pointed out that the Germans are spending or dispersing billions of euros towards supporting the war machine, do you see a practical path in which the Germans could actually decide to turn off the energy tap? Do you see any strategy, short, medium, or long, in which that becomes possible? And secondly, second question, you want the EU to hold out membership prospects to the Ukraine, but I'm wondering, what's your story about security guarantees? Zelensky is saying, I need security guarantees, and various suggestions are being put forward there. But the EU is not in itself in the business of security guarantees. It's in the business of economic integration and rule of law and open market and all that stuff. Is it coherent to think about offering the prospects of EU membership to the Ukraine in the absence of credible security guarantees?
Thank you very much, Michael. On the first question, it requires that the German economy is put on a sort of emergency footing, a semi-war footing, as it was during COVID. I mean, we've just done it. And there have now been very serious studies done by German economists which describe how you would do that with short-time working and so on, and estimating the cost. And over a year, the cost is somewhere between 2 to 4% of GDP, or roughly €1,000 a head, which could be redistributed, of course, on social grounds by the government. So it's doable, and it's affordable if you had the political will to do it. And it's particularly doable and affordable if you believe, as I do, that this is potentially a 6 to 9 months measure rather than necessarily a 5-year measure. That is to say, if the intention is to deliver such a hit to the Russian economy that the incentive structure for Vladimir Putin really shifts. So I think it's doable, I think it's affordable, but it requires a political leadership which we are not yet getting from Olaf Scholz. I'm very disappointed. Olaf Scholz, I think just yesterday, tweeted with some pride that he'd had a conversation with Vladimir Putin in which Vladimir Putin had accepted that Germany and the EU could continue to pay for Russian gas and oil in euros. Please may we continue to pay you billions of euros for your gas and oil. That doesn't feel to me like leadership in wartime. Michael, on your second question, I think it is compatible because of timeframes. Because the time frame for EU membership is 15 years plus. And in those 15 years, what you're needing to do is reconstruction, all the stuff you know from East Central Europe in the years between 1990 and 2004. And all that stuff is doable without the security guarantees. But of course, first of all, you have to ask the question, how the hell is this country going to have a lasting peace? My view on that is that the Ukrainians are on the hiding to nowhere with the notion of security guarantees, because they are the one country in Europe which actually had external security guarantees in the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, when my own country, the UK, Russia, and the US guaranteed their territorial integrity, and they weren't worth the paper they were written on. So I don't see how these new guarantees could be. So for me, the key thing is that neutralization does not mean demilitarization. In other words, that it should be Swiss-style neutrality, where you can, or Finnish-style neutrality, where you still have a strong defense, and you're simply capable to deter Russia from further aggression by your own defensive capability.
Thank you very much. My name is Zsuzsa Szelényi. I'm a former politician. I'm happy fellow of the Democracy Institute now. And of course, the scenarios that you described, especially the second one, the more realistic and realist, is exactly what Viktor Orbán is hoping for. I mean, he is already speaking about that there is life after the war, and that he could serve this process very well, and I think that's his calculus. But my question is that, what about a third option, a third scenario, which is a two-pace Europe? Well, two steps, like there are an inner circle, the core, with Germany, France, and the funding countries. Actually, in Berlin, they speak a lot about these options. And then another one where we Hungarians would stay, and of course the Balkans and other Eastern countries could join under a certain different status. So do you think, is this a realistic idea, and how would this play out?
So people talk about, concentric circles as a geometrical image that constantly recurs. I would ban all metaphors from discussions of the European Union, because they're only misleading, the bicycle metaphor or concentric circles. I think it's unrealistic for two reasons. First of all, because of the Eurozone, because it's actually very difficult to have a real political core Europe when you've got a large group of countries who have a common currency and increasingly are going to need elements of a common treasury. So that slightly prevents you having the right tight little Europe and then the rest, because some of the countries in your second category are already in the euro, right? So the Estonia or Slovakia. But secondly, because no existing EU member state is going to give up its right to be at the top table, the decision-making table in Brussels. And there is no mechanism anywhere in the EU treaties to deprive them of those rights. So that I don't believe such a structure can be formalized in any form. I think it will be through Merkelism. I mean, Merkel ran the EU through informal coalitions of the willing, making the key decisions in the European Council. And I think that's the future in which Carolingian Europe, so to speak, calls the shots.
If you don't mind, I will now read some of the questions we received on Facebook. The first one asks you about whether Europe will stay loyal to values, given the fact that today the news came out that the EU will fund the regime in Tunisia. The second one asks, just like Zsuzsa did, whether there is a third path between the two scenarios you outlined. And this one refers to a neutral Ukraine, however we wish to define it and achieve, that remains free to a degree, but remains united, unaligned, at least in defense terms. And then the following one, So that whether a neutral Ukraine, whether unaligned, probably what was meant, unaligned country can be envisaged. And finally, what kind of logic would Ukraine neutrality unleash for countries of Central Eastern Europe? Can we imagine a kind of respectability pressure emanating from Kiev, forcing the likes of Poland to behave like a more mature member of the EU community of democracies? So whether Ukraine could have actually a positive impact on the behavior of countries like Poland or Hungary.
So, to take the second question first, because it's very quickly answered, Zelensky has already essentially offered neutrality. And the key question is not whether neutrality, but what kind of neutrality. And the key question is the one I said in answer to Michael, which is it demilitarized neutrality or a neutrality in which you can still defend yourselves? The third question is a very interesting one. If you remember, Jean, this is what we all said after 1989, that the spirit of the West would be bought from ex-Oriental looks, that the spirit of the West would be bought from countries like Poland and Hungary and the Czech Republic and fed back into the old, weary, decadent democracies of Western Europe. I shared that hope. I'm not sure how much of it actually happened. And similarly, in this case, while I think that Ukraine today is reminding us, as I said, that freedom has to be fought for by peaceful means, but when push comes to shove, ultimately with a weapon in your hand. And that's a really important lesson for us. So to that extent, I think it's true. But to be honest, the notion that this extremely shaky and corrupt democracy that, let's be honest, was Ukraine before the war, even under Zelensky, could somehow suddenly become a model, seems to me a hope too far. The first question is an incredibly interesting one. And let me make 2 points about this. First of all, the EU has always had double standards. Its relations with those outside and those inside. But these double standards are becoming more painful, particularly because of the issue of migration. Because we have seen that migration is capable of blowing our politics apart, and that if you just get 2 million people coming in 2015, 2016, it boosts populists through the roof. The EU is now doing everything it can to build a fortress Europe. And part of that involves accepting, and even in the extreme cases, I'm afraid, funding not just autocracies like Turkey, but autocracies making human rights violations, like the migrants who are turned back and put into dreadful camps in Libya. So I think there is a growing problem there. And behind that is a larger issue, which is, if you remember the wonderful, glorious, optimistic, heady days around the early 2000s when Mark Leonard wrote a book called Why Europe Will Run the 21st Century. Do you remember that? Remember that? And Europe was going to be a model for the rest of the world. Europäischen Wesen soll die Welt genesen. And everyone was going to follow our example. And I think it is quite striking 20 years later to look at how different, how defensive, how civilizationally defensive the European rhetoric has become. And there is a real sense in which I think Europe has gone from being naively universalist to exceptionalist. It's no longer where the way the rest of the world could and should become. It's just leave us alone to be the way we are.
Dimitri Kochin of CEU Democracy Institute. I would like to push your assumptions a little bit further about what pre-accession is and what is its importance in the context of EU enlargement law. You told us that it will take 15 years for Ukraine to accede. But if we look at the German Democratic Republic, if we look at the first enlargement, if we look at the second enlargement, Greece, Spain, Portugal, the notion of the pre-accession didn't exist in this very way as we observed it when Central and Eastern Europe acceded. So would you consider it possible from the depth of your historical knowledge of EU enlargements to make an exception for Ukraine and precisely to put it as a full member first, while letting it 15 years, 20 years, 25 years if necessary to adapt to the acquis? And here, to justify this special position, I think we have enough money to back this, because the West has seized 800 billion, probably even more, of Russian money from the oligarchs, from the central bank, from government assets. Could that money be used both as a boost and as a way to justify the exceptional treatment of Ukraine, in order to put it ahead of the candidates, and in order to show that a different way to organize Europe is possible? And by saying a different way, I'm reminded we're in Hungary, and to me, Hungary is precisely the example of an absolute moral failure of the idea of pre-accession, because this country was precisely the poster child of what pre-accession was supposed to mean, and it failed. And Poland also failed, and others might fail. So post-accession is important, but do we need pre-accession?
Thank you very much. I mean, for me, Hungary is a failure of post-accession conditionality, not pre-accession conditionality. Let me just take you through a little bit with your history. I mean, remember that the GDR was a secret member of the EEC. It had trade access, and then automatically became a member of the European Community, of the EU. In fact, it's very funny when you look at the maps of EU enlargement, which are now handed out to European school children, it appears as if the GDR was a member of the European Union from 1957. And Spain, Portugal, and Greece, maybe they didn't have formal pre-accession conditionality, but absolutely the transition to democracy and the transition to Europe went hand in hand in their own thinking. I do not agree that it would be feasible to take in Ukraine as a full member straight away. I think it would just blow apart the functioning of the EU. But what I do think we could consider is more sectoral differentiation. That is to say, I think the EU, and particularly the Brussels bureaucracy, is too inflexible about thinking about the nature of EU membership, that everybody has to take all the same steps and open and close all the same chapters before finally, you know, you've driven 200 kilometers down the same motorway and you get to the same destination. So that, for example, one could imagine Ukraine coming earlier into the energy union or becoming part of the green transition agenda. It already has visa-free travel. So I think there is some creative thinking to be done about flexibility in thinking about what EU membership means. It's not all or nothing. There can be sectoral full membership, but I still think it would take and should take a long time.
Thank you so much, Tim, for the really deep talk. And my question is about the proper Europe versus the not really proper Europe, and how do you see the chances to improve the credibility and integrity of Europe, or that part of Europe which is considered according to the stereotypes you mentioned as the proper part? And what I mean, for example, is that in Brussels, I'm surprised, I don't want to give thoughts for the organ government, but I'm surprised they have been not attacking that statues of Leopold, streets and squares named after Leopold are still there, although he is responsible for the death of millions in the Belgian Congo. And it seems to me that I hope it's clear why I bring it up, because I think that's a big integrity issue, and that makes it possible for for a government like the Orban government to argue that why are you criticizing us? Look at your own courtyard.
Yeah, no, it's a very good point. And, you know, as I said, I've been writing this history of contemporary Europe. And, you know, one of the things that strikes one looking back over the last half century is just how little my generation of Europeans reflected on our own colonial legacy. My own grandfather was in the Indian civil service. He spent his whole working life in India. He was part of this empire. We didn't think it was a problem. We just didn't confront it at all. That was past. It was ancient history. Europe was the future. And it takes the generation of our children or even grandchildren to say roads must fall and to confront us with our own colonial past. So I think that is a very interesting point. With wider application to those who might think that, you know, Belgium or France are just impeccable examples of Enlightenment civilization, if you look beyond their shores. I don't actually think it's the heart of the problem. I think that those old European prejudices and stereotypes summed up in the phrase of the French writer Gonzague de Reynaud, who talked about l'Europe européenne, European Europe. So logically, there's non-European Europe, which is a contradiction in terms, but this notion is very, very deep. The notion that German scholars between the wars, they talked about the Kulturgefälle, the cultural gradient that goes from west to east. People who would be horrified to think that they harbored such imperial thoughts do in fact harbor such thoughts. So that I think there's a, you know, you're absolutely right. There's a big educational task to dig out these prejudices.
We have received 3 more comments. Let me summarize them. The first one is from a Pole who is worried not only about Russia, but also about Germany, and asks you to summarize the modern Ostpolitik of Germany. The second is from someone who thinks, it's more an opinion, who thinks that the Germans should be able to swallow this 3-4% drop in GDP, given that the Brits have to survive the same with Brexit. And then the third one is again a question asking you how the European institutions will react to the possible victory of Orban, how his government will be treated, especially considering the latest news, according to which the Russians managed to break into the Ministry of Foreign Affairs dataset.
Thank you very much, Zsolt. I think my history of German Ostpolitik had about 500 pages, so I'm not sure how I can summarize it in 50 seconds. But what I would just say again is that Germany at this moment has no Ostpolitik. It's in ruins. It had a rather successful Ostpolitik, which started with the building of the Berlin Wall in 1961 and culminated in German unification. It had a rather unsuccessful Ostpolitik, which started with German unification and the end of the Soviet Union, and with which, by the way, in the 1990s, it was not wrong to think that we might try to make a modernization partnership with Russia. That was not wrong, and indeed that was the promise that Helmut Kohl had made to Mikhail Gorbachev, and we in the West had made. The mistake was not to start down the course. The mistake was not to revise it when the facts changed. 2008, Georgia, but at the very latest, 2014, Nord Stream 2 was built since 2014. That is the shame of Ostpolitik. Now they have none, and they have to get another one. 4% GDP, oh gosh, do we have to talk about Brexit, please? Look, we've lost 4% of our GDP for a very bad cause. Germany would be losing 4% of its GDP for a very good cause. I think that's a significant difference. And also, it would be a one-off, probably short term. ours. Well, don't get me started. Now, the Hungary question, I'd love to hear, by the way, from Hungarian political scientists and analysts in the room. Undoubtedly, and the cyber attacks, that recent story, intelligence sharing, Western intelligence sharing with frontline states. So a lot of intelligence is being shared with Poland. Are you going to share that intelligence with Hungary? So there are major security concerns there. I would say particularly in NATO, actually. I think we have to distinguish here. In the EU, I think people will be wary, as they have been already, but as I rather pessimistically argued, I think given all these other challenges, they may be tempted to go with the old line, he may be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
Alex Folady, freelance journalist. You put great store in your presentation on the possibility of further expansion of the EU as a part of the solution to the conundrum we face. And you said there was no contradiction between expansion and deepening, but that does seem to run very counter to the consensus amongst very many political scientists that one of the reasons Hungary has been able to, or rather that the Orban government has been able to place Hungary in the position that we now see, is that the institutional consolidation that the EU should have done, it did not do, because it focused on expansion when it should have focused on institutional consolidation and misused its limited bandwidth. What is it that gives you the confidence that that analysis is wrong, especially bearing in mind that it seems to be borne out that by Hungary having continued to press for EU expansion at the cost of institutional consolidation as part of its own diplomatic manoeuvring over rule of law and illiberalism?
So in the 1990s and early 2000s, the EU did both. It did both widening and deepening. It had two big projects. One was enlargement, the other was monetary union. So it's not true to say that it only did enlargement. And there were qualified majority voting was extended and so on. What it failed to anticipate and address was post-accession conditionality. So there was no linkage made between the money, the huge amounts of money, and the values enshrined in the treaties, which at least in theory the EU is beginning to address at the moment. Where I think you put your finger on something is that if you're going to get serious about the strategy, which I'm describing, which one could loosely call a European Ostpolitik, you would have to address the problems that Hungary has revealed. And many of you will know an excellent article by Daniel Kellerman on the EU's authoritarian equilibrium, which says, Hungarian semi-authoritarianism has been sustained by three things: freedom of movement, the money, and what he calls partial politicization. So it's a partial politicization in the form of the European party groupings, notably the EPP, which so much protected Fidesz. So there is indeed a logic which would say that if you were going to make a success of a larger enlargement, you would need more politicization. But please not around these European party groupings, because they've actually been more of a curse than a blessing for the European Union. So then the question is posed, so how would that look?
Hello, thank you. My name is Kester Eddy. I'm also a journalist. Regardless of the military outcome of this conflict, I think there's a wedge driven now between Ukrainians, even Russian-speaking Ukrainians, and Russia in many cases. So, in a sense, sooner or later, Russia won't win this. Ukraine's kind of defined itself, I think, as an independent nation now, or its aspirations that way. But also, what do you think this has done or doing for Putin's future and the future of an authoritarian Russia? Because we've got the intellectual elites in Petersburg and Moscow and a few other places, but when the body's coming home in these coffins, can it bring about Russia's or Putin's Afghanistan, as I think somebody said? What are your thoughts on that, please?
It's very important for people now and then to say the words, I don't know. If people don't say that often enough. And I don't know, of course, any more than anyone else does what the likely development inside Russia is. It seems implausible because, first of all, he has three major security structures, the military, the FSB, and Rosgvardia. And he, at the moment, controls them all. And if there was going to be any push, they'd have to work together. Otherwise, he'd have one to play off against the others, and he's terrorizing their leaderships. The evidence is that there's no major popular movement against Putin at the moment. And as so often, there was the old joke that emigration is the German form of revolution. Well, maybe emigration is the Russian form of revolution, because obviously more middle-class, educated, liberal Russians are simply going to leave. So that I wouldn't get your hopes up anytime soon. You're absolutely right that Vladimir Putin is the evil, unintentional godfather of Ukrainian independence and Ukrainian national unity. In a way, you would almost say there should be statues to Putin in Ukraine, because this nation, which had a very fragile shared identity, when it almost unintentionally got independence in 1991, now has an incredibly strong identity. So that's an irony which future historians may want to point out.
Hi, my name is Darina Kryagina. I'm a CU alumni, and as of recently, a Ukrainian refugee. I kind of wanted to ask you why are you speaking with such certainty of the Ukrainian neutrality, first of all? Because, as far as our constitution goes, we are very much aiming to, that's actually in our constitution, that we are aiming to join EU and NATO. And how much popularity Zelensky is enjoying right now, we can very easily take him down just as much as he is building himself up by standing up. Yeah, because we do have an experience of actually holding successful revolutions. I was on Maidan myself, so I don't know why the West shares this opinion that once our politicians have voiced some sort of a path, it's going to be immediately accepted by the people, and the people are the voice in the Ukraine right now more than ever, I would say. You said right now that we should put statues to Putin because he consolidated us. I get the joke. I very much do. But I would say that we were much more banded together than anyone thought possible outside of Ukraine. We do seem like we fight a lot, but we definitely unite incredibly well in the times of external threat, and that time actually came in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea and Donbass, and the processes inside may have seemed like that's on the outside they have seemed like strife and instability, like weak democracy, but I assure you that there is definitely much more hope than it seems like. So yeah, my main question was about the neutrality. Like, I don't agree that it's just given at this point, and that's something that Ukrainians will accept.
It's really important to say it's entirely up to you, to the Ukrainians. And I can understand why you might react a bit allergically when someone with a British or French or German accent starts talking about these things. It's really important that we don't get ourselves in the position that we got ourselves into with Yalta. Because the problem with Yalta was not in 1945 that we didn't stop the Russians taking over Eastern Europe, because they were already there because of the course of the war. The problem was that we, Churchill, Roosevelt, gave an ambiguous legitimacy to the settlement, to the Soviet takeover of Eastern Europe. And so what I take from you, and I think it's a really important point, is that France and Germany in particular really have to watch out that they don't get themselves into that morally very problematic position of somehow giving a dubious legitimacy to any peace settlement that comes out of the war. So leave it to the Israelis or the Turks or whoever to be the mediator, but ultimately it's going to be up to you. What, however, Zelensky said, and is clearly true, remember what he said? He said two things. First of all, he said, well, the reality is NATO doesn't want that, right? And that's true. That's true. NATO was lying, was stringing you along when it said Ukraine and Georgia will be. The consensus in NATO was that Ukraine isn't going to be a member of NATO in the foreseeable future. So I think that's realism on his part. And the second thing he said, may I remind you, is whatever security deal we make, it has to be put to a referendum. So it would be up to you.
Thank you very much. Very interesting lecture and very interesting arguments. My name is Gabriel Agoston. I'm a PhD student at the University of Manchester. And asking my question is very difficult after the hopeful comments and opinion what we just heard here, but it also ties into it. So my question is, in terms of the political integrity of the European Union and also in terms of Europe, so in case this war ends in, let's say, ends with an agreement or a peace treaty that somehow compromises the territorial integrity of Ukraine, or as you mentioned, so as a post-colonial arrangement, and let's say the core EU countries, what I'm thinking of here is obviously mainly France or Germany, tacitly or somehow acknowledges or agrees to this agreement, or this peace treaty or post-colonial agreement, what kind of message does that send to Eastern Europe? And what I mean here is Poland, the Baltics, Czech Republic. I think we can discount Orban's Hungary in this case, because in these Eastern countries, the sort of anti-Russian, anti-Soviet sentiments are a lot more socially, historically, in a way, institutionally more embedded than in the West. This is my first question. The second question is, what do you think, let's say the EU would agree to an accession agreement with the Ukraine, how would that impact upon the process of accession with Turkey? Especially thinking about the fact that the Merkel and obviously the European Union signed a deal with Turkey in 2016 for keeping out a huge amount of refugees. So in those terms, how would that impact? How would that, what kind of message does that send to Turkey in case that, the EU in a way have been trying to keep them out for quite some time? Thank you very much.
Well, Recep Tayyip Erdogan has been doing quite a bit to keep them out too, there are criteria that you have to fulfill, and Turkey has moved away from rather than towards those criteria. So it was when Turkey was actually trying very hard to win the accession to the EU that it became a major challenge to core Europe. On your first point, it is obviously an extremely dangerous precedent for us ever to accept that frontiers can be changed by force. And it's not just about Eastern Europe, it's about East Asia, it's about Taiwan. So we have to be very, very careful about that, setting that precedent. It goes back to the previous question. It has to be up to the Ukrainians, what they are ready to accept. I think that's too far in the future. But I would come back once again to the case of Cyprus, which is actually a frozen conflict. And a compromise has been found, and a compromise which I think is very much to the benefit of Cyprus.
Clearly, many of us would like to continue the discussion, but we have to close at this moment. Let me thank Robert Niemann for helping me with Facebook. Let me thank all of you for coming and participating. But let me thank particularly our lecturer, our guru in some sense, who made us feel privileged in the last 1.5 hours. Thank you very much. Join me in applauding him.